They said don't touch it. So I touched it. Amber Wesson slammed the wrench down, grease smeared to her elbows, heart hammering because the bike was done. Fixed. Perfect. And nobody in that garage could say otherwise. But before the engine even cooled, her boss was already walking toward her with that look on his face. The kind that doesn't mean congratulations. If this story hits you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this ride goes. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and stay with me till the very end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The wrench turned one last time and something clicked, not just in the engine, but somewhere deep inside Amber Wesson's chest. That satisfying bone-deep click of a thing gone right. She exhaled slowly, pulled her hands back from the bike, and stared at it the way a sculptor stares at something they've just pulled out of stone. It was done. 11 days it had sat in the back corner of Sullivan's Auto, behind the hydraulic lift, draped in a tarp that nobody dared move. 11 days of whispers, of coworkers walking past it with their eyes down, pretending it wasn't there. Of David Sullivan himself saying every single morning without fail, "Leave it alone, we're not touching that one." But Amber had touched it, and now it ran. She wiped her hands on a shop rag, rolling her shoulders back, working out the knot that had lived between her shoulder blades for the last 4 hours. It was 11:47 at night. She knew because she'd checked her phone at 11:30 and told herself 15 more minutes. That had been the third time she told herself 15 more minutes. The garage was mostly dark except for the work light she'd clamped to the handlebars and the pale, stuttering fluorescence above the main bay that Sullivan had been meaning to fix since March and hadn't. The other mechanics had gone home hours ago. Even Ricky, who usually stayed late to listen to baseball on the old radio by the register, had packed it in by 9. It was just Amber, and the bike, and the silence. She stepped back and looked at the motorcycle the way you look at something that both thrills you and frightens you at the same time. A 2021 Harley-Davidson CVO Road Glide, custom-built, extensively modified, painted in a deep matte black with hand-engraved chrome detail along the forks and tank. $75,000 at minimum. Probably more given what someone had clearly poured into the custom work on the exhaust and the upgraded Milwaukee 8 engine that had given everyone the most trouble. The previous mechanic guy named Pete, decent with imports, totally out of his depth, with something this specialized, had cracked a component during disassembly, and then instead of owning it, had quietly reassembled what he could and told Sullivan the bike was beyond their scope. Sullivan had accepted that, written it off, told the owner it needed to go to a specialist shop. The owner hadn't responded, and for 11 days the bike had sat. Amber had known what was wrong with it the first time she looked at it. She hadn't said anything then because she was still reading the room, still figuring out where she stood at Sullivan's. She'd only been there 4 months, transferred from a shop in Pilsen that closed when the owner retired, and she was still the youngest mechanic on the floor by 7 years, and the only woman by a considerable margin. She'd learned early that being right and being listened to were two very different things, and that sometimes the smartest move was to wait. But 11 days was long enough. She'd come in that morning, done her regular work, clocked out at 5 like everyone else, driven to the diner on Kimball for coffee, and a chicken sandwich, sat with her thoughts for an hour, and then driven back. She used her key. Sullivan had given all senior mechanics a key, though she suspected he'd forgotten she had one, and let herself into the back. She'd worked alone, quietly, carefully. And now the bike ran. She put her tools away with the kind of deliberate slowness that comes from being too tired to rush and too satisfied to care. Each wrench went back in its slot. The diagnostic tablet got wiped down and set on the shelf. She coiled the shop light cord with her left hand loop by loop, the way her father had taught her when she was 7 years old, standing in his garage in Rockford, watching him work with that focused quiet she'd spent her whole life trying to replicate. She almost didn't hear the door. Almost. The side door to the garage, the one that opened onto the side lot, not the main bay doors, clicked open with a sound that was soft enough to miss, but specific enough in a space that quiet to hit like a gunshot. Amber didn't spin around. She'd grown up in a rough enough part of the world to know that spinning around was the wrong move. She set the shop light down on the workbench with careful, controlled movements and turned slowly. 3 men stood in the doorway. She recognized the cuts, the leather vests with the patches, before she made out their faces. The Hells Angels insignia wasn't something you misidentified. The one in the middle was large, not in a showy way, but in the way of someone who had simply always been large, who had never needed to announce it. He had a beard that was mostly gray hands like engine blocks, and eyes that were doing the thing that certain men's eyes do when they're trying to figure out whether they need to be angry yet. "Shop's closed," Amber said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. "We can see that," the large man said. His voice was low and measured. Not threatening exactly, but the kind of voice that didn't have to be. "We got a call. Someone said our bike was ready." Amber looked at him, then at the bike, then back at him. "Who called you? Anonymous text," he said, "to our chapter's number." Amber hadn't sent any text. She told no one she was here. She processed this information quickly, filed it for later, and made a decision. "Your bike is ready," she said. The large man's eyes moved to the CVO road glide behind her. He walked toward it slowly, and the other two followed. Amber stepped aside but didn't step back. There was a difference, and she knew it mattered. He crouched down beside the bike. A man that size crouching with that kind of ease told you everything about his relationship with motorcycles and ran his hand along the tank. He looked at the exhaust. He looked at the engine. He was quiet for a long time. "Pete told Sullivan it couldn't be fixed," he said without looking up. "Pete was wrong," Amber said. "Pete's been working on bikes for 20 years. And he still cracked the primary cover on disassembly because he was rushing and didn't properly warm the engine first. Then he put it back together without addressing the root problem, which was a failed inner primary bearing that was causing vibration that was throwing off everything downstream." She paused. "He wasn't wrong because he's bad at his job. He was wrong because he panicked." The large man looked up at her then, really looked at her. The two men flanking him shifted slightly. "You fixed a primary bearing failure," he said slowly, "and replaced the clutch hub that had worn unevenly because of it, reseated the compensator, replaced the cam chain tensioners, while I had everything apart since they were original and due anyway, and adjusted the throttle body sync because it was pulling lean on the right cylinder." She held his gaze. "It'll run the way it was meant to run now, probably better than it did before Pete got to it." Silence. Then the large man stood up and he smiled. It was not the smile Amber had been braced for. It was smaller than that and more genuine. "Start it," he said. She did. She pressed the starter, and the Milwaukee 8 fired with that low, authoritative rumble that a well-tuned Harley makes when everything is exactly right. The sound filled the garage rich, and even no hesitation, no roughness, just power running clean through a machine that had been broken and was now unambiguously fixed. The large man closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When he opened them, something had shifted. "What's your name?" he said. Amber Wesson." "I'm Rex," he said. He didn't offer a last name and she didn't ask. "How long did this take you?" "Tonight about 4 hours. I spent time earlier in the week reading up on some of the custom modifications on the engine. Whoever built this out did some non-standard work on the cam plate that I wanted to understand before I touched it." "You researched our bike on your own time," Rex said. "Not a question. I research anything I'm going to work on." Rex looked at the bike for another long moment. Then he looked at Amber. "Sullivan know you did this?" "No." "Why not?" Amber thought about how to answer that. She chose honest, because he would have told me not to. Rex was quiet again. The two flanking men were watching him, reading him the way people watch a weather system to see which direction it's moving. "Sullivan's a coward," Rex said finally. "I knew that when he told me his shop couldn't handle our work. 20 years we brought him business. 20 years. He shook his head slowly. "We'll settle the invoice. And we'll settle something else too." He looked at Amber directly. "You got a card." Amber had in her whole life printed exactly one business card for a job interview 3 years ago and had given away 0 of them because she'd never gotten into the habit. She shook her head. "No card, sorry." "Phone number," he said. One of the flanking men pulled out his phone. She gave it to him. She wasn't sure in that moment whether this was a good idea or a neutral idea, but she knew instinctively that it was the only idea. These were not men you said no to over something small. And besides, she'd fixed their bike. That had to count for something. "Amber Wesson," Rex said again, as if committing it to memory. "Sullivan's got no idea what he's got working in his shop. I'm fairly sure Sullivan's primary impression of me is that I ask too many questions and park in the spot closest to the door," Amber said. Rex looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed. It was a real laugh startled out of him, and it changed his whole face. The 2 other men relaxed visibly. "We're going to take the bike," he said. "We'll come back in the morning to settle up." "You'll want to let it run for about 15 minutes before you put it on the highway," Amber said. "Let everything heat cycle properly, and check the primary oil level after the first 100 miles I topped it off. But I want you watching it just in case I missed anything, Which I don't think I did, but I want you to check. Rex nodded with the gravity of a man receiving actual instruction and respecting it. We'll check. They walked the bike out through the side door. Amber heard the starter, heard the engine rumble to life out in the lot, heard it idle for a minute, heard it pull away. Then silence again. She stood in the empty garage for a moment, breathing. Then she cleaned up the last of her tools, turned off the work lights, and locked the side door behind her. She drove home on the Kennedy, windows down, despite the October cold, feeling the specific kind of exhausted that only comes from having done something difficult and done it right. She wasn't thinking about consequences. She was too tired for consequences. She was thinking about the sound that engine made when it fired, that clean, even rumble, that sound of a thing working the way it was supposed to work. She was thinking about how that never got old. She parked outside her apartment building on Diversey, climbed the stairs to the third floor, fed her cat a gray tabby named Clutch, for obvious reasons, and fell asleep on top of the covers, still wearing her work shirt. She slept better than she had in weeks. Yeah. She was back at the shop by 7:15 the next morning. The lot was already half full. She could hear the air compressor running inside, which meant Ricky was in, and the lights in the main bay were on. She pushed through the front door, nodded at the woman at the front desk, Patricia, 50-something, reading glasses, perpetually pushed up on her head, and headed for the locker room to change into her work gear. "Morning," she said. "Morning, Han," Patricia said without looking up from the computer. Then a beat later, she looked up. "Amber, David wants to see you." Amber stopped. "Now, soon as you get in." Patricia's voice was neutral in the careful way of someone who knows something and has decided not to be the one to say it. Amber took a breath, let it out. "Okay." David Sullivan's office was at the back of the building, a glass-walled room that let him see the main floor while doing paperwork, which he seemed to resent on both ends. He was a man in his early 60s who had built Sullivan's Auto from a two-bay operation in the early 90s into a legitimate, profitable shop, and who carried the weight of that accomplishment in a way that had over time become more burden than pride. He was sitting at his desk when Amber knocked on the open door. "Close it," he said. She closed it. "Sit down." She sat. Sullivan looked at her across the desk with the expression of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say and is now uncertain whether the rehearsal was sufficient. "You were here last night," he said. "I was." "After hours?" "Yes." "You worked on the Hells Angels bike?" "I did." Sullivan was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved slightly the way it did when he was working something over. "I specifically said that bike wasn't to be touched," he said. "You said it was beyond our scope," Amber said. "I disagreed with that assessment." "You disagreed." His voice was flat. "Amber, I have been running this shop for 30 years. I have made decisions about what work we take and what work we don't take for 30 years. That is not a judgment call that belongs to a mechanic who's been here 4 months." Amber felt the heat start to rise in her chest but kept her voice steady. "With respect, the decision about what we could technically accomplish wasn't a business decision. It was a mechanical one. And mechanically, the bike was fixable. Pete made an error on disassembly and then assessed the whole job as unworkable rather than address the error. I addressed the error. Pete's assessment," Sullivan said slowly, "was that taking that job carried more risk than it was worth. That is a judgment call I backed. And you went around me. I fixed a $75,000 motorcycle for a customer who's been coming to this shop for 20 years, Amber said. I fixed it correctly in about 4 hours on my own time at no cost to the shop." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Sullivan leaned forward. His voice dropped and it got harder. "The point is that those men are dangerous. The point is that I have a responsibility to my staff and to this business, and I have spent 20 years maintaining a relationship with that group that is exactly as limited as I want it to be. You don't know what you walked into last night. You don't know the history. You made a decision with no information and no authorization, and you could have gotten yourself hurt or gotten someone else hurt, and you didn't think about anyone but yourself and he paused, searching for the word, your need to prove something. Something shifted in Amber's chest. The heat was still there, but it went cold at the edges. "I've been proving things my whole career," she said quietly. "I didn't get hired at places like this because people assumed I was competent. I had to show it every time to every person from the beginning. If that looks like something else to you, I understand. But I did not make that decision carelessly. I made it because it was the right call mechanically and because a customer was sitting with an unresolved problem that this shop failed to address. Sullivan looked at her for a long moment. "I'm going to have to let you go," he said. The words landed in the room and sat there. Amber heard them. Fully, she let them settle before she responded. "You're firing me," she said. "I'm terminating your employment, yes. Effective today. You'll receive your last paycheck by the end of the week and—" "You're firing me," she said again, "because I fixed a motorcycle. I'm terminating your employment because you directly defied my instructions. You put yourself and potentially others at risk, and you demonstrated that you cannot work within the structure of this shop." He said it like he had rehearsed it because he had. "It's not about the repair. It's entirely about the repair," Amber said. "And it's about the fact that I was right, and you know I was right, and that's the part that's actually bothering you." Sullivan said nothing. Amber stood up. She was very careful in that moment about what she did with her hands, her face, the way she held herself. She had learned a long time ago that in situations like this, everything was data. Everything was evidence. If she let the anger show, it would be used against her. If she cried, and she wasn't going to cry, but if she did, that would be used against her too. The only move was stillness. "I'll collect my tools," she said. "Security will assist." "I don't need assistance," she said it calmly. "I know where my tools are. I put them away myself last night." She walked out of the office without slamming the door. The main floor had gone quiet. Not completely, the compressor was still running. The radio in the corner was still on, but the human part of it had gone quiet. Word traveled fast in a closed space. People knew. She could feel it in the way Ricky didn't look up from his bay, and in the way Marcus, who was young and new and hadn't yet learned how to hide his expressions, looked at her with something that was half sympathy and half alarm. She went to her toolbox, a 5-drawer Snap-on she'd bought herself piece by piece over 8 years, and which represented more sentimental value than she would have admitted to anyone, and began transferring tools to her bag methodically. Sockets first, extensions, ratchets, the specialty tools she'd accumulated for European cars and for bikes, the ones she'd had machined to her specifications in some cases. Amber. It was Ricky. He'd come up behind her, quiet as a man his size could be. "I'm fine," she said without turning around. "I know you're fine," he said. "That's not what I was going to say." She turned and looked at him. Ricky Dominguez had been at Sullivan's for 14 years. He was a large man, meticulous with his hands, who listened to baseball and made the same 3 sandwiches on rotation, and who had in 4 months said exactly what he meant to her every single time, which was rarer than people understood. "What were you going to say?" she asked. "That what you did last night was right," he said. "The mechanical part and the other part. And that David is wrong, and that the rest of us," he paused, glancing back toward the bay, "we all know it." Amber looked at him for a moment. The heat in her chest, which had been holding itself in careful suspension since Sullivan's office, flickered. "Okay," she said. "You going to be okay?" "I'm going to be okay," she said. And she meant it, though she wasn't entirely sure yet what okay looked like from here. "You need a reference, you call me," Ricky said. "Not Sullivan, me. I'll tell anyone who asks exactly what kind of mechanic you are." She finished packing her tools. She picked up the bag. It was heavy, the real weight of a working life, and she walked to the front of the shop. Patricia at the desk had gone carefully busy with something on her computer. 2 of the other mechanics found reasons to be facing away. Marcus was standing near the door. He was 24, maybe 25, still growing into his hands. He looked at Amber as she passed, and he said quietly, "That was a really good fix. I looked at it this morning before everyone got in. Really clean work." Amber stopped. She looked at him. "Learn from Pete's mistake," she said. "Not the mechanical one. The other one. The one where he decided it was easier to say he couldn't do it than to admit he'd made an error. That's the mistake you really can't afford to make." Marcus nodded, and he meant it. She pushed through the front door and walked to her car. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of October morning that feels like a preview of something harder coming. She loaded the tool bag into her trunk,